Hey guys, welcome back to a new episode of Dirt and Grip. We're over here in Salem, Ohio at John Kufleitner's Galleria. And this weekend we're going to be celebrating our country's 250th birthday. And to do that, we thought we'd go through the history of racing in our country. Now, America, as we all can see through our great heritage of muscle and power, it was built for racing. As soon as we got automobiles and there was an engine and things, we figured out how to go fast. But we can't really talk about any of that before we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Because in the beginning, before the NHRA or the your sand drags, your tractor pulling, in 1985, on Thanksgiving Day in Chicago, the very first documented race was set out. It was 54 miles cross country, and at the time there were 6 racers total, but the weather was not great. There was lots of ice, lots of snow. It was one of the worst snowstorms of that decade. And only 2 drivers finished. The other 4 broke down for various reasons, mostly relating to the weather. And the winner, Frank Duryea, he won with an average speed of 7.5 miles an hour. A truly blistering speed. Now, that's not the true success of that race. The true success of that race was proving that these automobiles, this newfangled creation, could not only compete, but overwhelm what a horse could do. It could go faster and for longer. And it didn't get tired or need water or food to do it. You just needed to put gas in the engine. From there, racing took off. Mostly it was in grassroots. There would be just a group of boys on a Saturday or a Sunday racing back roads and getting into trouble with local law. But eventually, those boys grew up into men, and they got together and they made circuits, those more like road tracks, onto the dirt roads. And then eventually, the automakers began to take notice. You see, they noticed that at these races where the community come together on a weekend, if their car won on Monday, they started selling cars. And it created the saying at the time that if you won on Sunday, you sold on Monday. And, as always, the competition bred innovation. The big 3 manufacturers at the time, the same ones that we have today, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, they began to pursue horsepower. It translated into better engines with more power, better braking, going from drums to disc braking, better tires, rubber in the tire, and how they made the tread itself to gain traction, allow for higher speeds and greater control, even into the fuels, eventually removing the lead in the fuel, which was designed to help lubricate the engine, which would allow those next generation of engines to run hotter and produce more power. And even today, that tradition continues, where racing teams all across the country are making innovations in fuel economy, horsepower, pushing engines to the absolute limit, and the automakers, as always, are taking notice and taking some of those innovations and putting them to the next generation of horsepower. But we can't really talk about America's love of racing without also talking about America's love affair with the V8. And interestingly, the V8 was not created in America. It was created in France. You see, at the time, the only engines you had were 4 cylinders or 6 cylinders, and they were generally in the inline, where one cylinder was behind the next. And so an 8-cylinder engine would just be way too big for a production car. It'd be too long. There'd be no feasible economic way to put it into a vehicle and mass produce it. And then this inventor figured out a way to take 4 cylinders on each side on a V-shaped 90-degree, which allowed shorter overall dimensions and allowed it to fit into a car at the time. And even Rolls-Royce tried their hand in the early 1900s to do this, but it was not a commercial success. In fact, that wouldn't happen until Cadillac produced in 1914 their V8. It was a very, very low horsepower, modest engine. But what they said, what their commercial success was owed to, was how smooth the engine ran. And then later with Ford in 1932, the V8 truly began to lift off with the flathead. Now, the flathead was revolutionary when it comes to horsepower. You see, up until then, engines were not made in a single block with additional parts bolted onto it. Each block was 3, 4, even sometimes 5 or 6 pieces that were, after creation, were put together and then put under the hood, which increased costs and production. What Ford did with the flathead V8 was create a single cast block, which allowed for greater internal pressure, greater stability, higher horsepower, and better torque. And it was highly modifiable. Although the original run of the V8 was only 221 cubic inches and only had about 65 horsepower. At the time, the average American with the average American of Ford, that was well above what the rest of the competition could bring to the table. And as always, as we know even today, that the flathead V8 sounded incredible when you were driving it. And then we hit World War II. Young men went away and then they came back. And when they came back, most of them had a need to feel the same kind of adrenaline that they felt the entire time that they were in foreign theater. That something was missing, it was dull and boring. And so they used the money that they had made in World War II fighting for our country. And they purchased the cheap surplus equipment that our country used to build the tanks and the planes and the ships. And they started improving their cars. Companies like Edelbrock started up to provide things like higher, like larger, even dual carburetors to allow for greater fuel into the engine itself. Even going so far as to creating special air filters that will allow higher airflow, but still also make sure none of the dust and particulates from the racing at this time on mostly dirt tracks would get into the engine and ruin the internals. And it just simply goes to show that no matter what era, that young men always want to go fast. But then, eventually we got to the 60s and what we know now as the golden era of horsepower, or the muscle car era. Now, in the 1960s, there was a massive horsepower race. This horsepower race was fueled by all the big three. There was Chevy coming out with their small block V8, which revolutionized how V8s were seen. Highly modular, very light for how much power you could produce, and what you traded off in torque you could gain in high RPMs and high-end horsepower. And then you had Ford with their total performance program, creating iconic things like the GT40, which went over to Le Mans and showed that America, even though we were new to the table with performance, we could perform and beat names like Ferrari. And then Chrysler comes out with their 462 Hemi, the mainstay of Chrysler Dodge power for the next 4 decades at least. Pontiac with the 1964 GTO, a car that was built to perform with not only reliability but balance, an engineered marvel to drive as easily on the street as it would be on the track. Oldsmobile dropping their hat into the ring with the Olds 442, and then Buick with the GS 455, each building on the other in their respective departments and things like horsepower and the innovations that each other GM product had made. And then Plymouth with the Roadrunner. Now Plymouth, they weren't designing a car to exceed everyone else in horsepower or handling. What they brought to the table was a cheap, affordable car that could go fast and had lots of power and that was customizable. And this appealed to a broad range, and that's why through so many old racing clips you could see so many Plymouth Roadrunners on the track. And you've got Dodge with their attitude, bold styling, and big engines, taking that Hemi that Chrysler had built and installing it into things like the Challenger and the Charger. And last but not least, AMC. AMC, a smaller name in the game, no longer exists now, but they found their niche on the track with lighter vehicles producing the same, if not more power than everyone else. What they would do is they would simply punch up to everyone around them, and then they would win. And all of these innovations produce the sound of America. The V8, no matter where you go in the world, the American V8 is iconic in how it sounds. No other engine built by any other country's car, no matter displacement, does not sound the way that American V8 sounds. And then we have to get into the racing families. You see, once again, repeating this, racers didn't start out as anything else but average Joes working on their car, taking it to the track on the weekend to see if they could beat their buddy on the other side of town. Their whole drive was to have fun and go fast. And interestingly enough, now most racers are not first generation. You will rarely see a racer today who just started out racing. They've always gotten into because of their families. Second, third, fourth, even fifth generation racers today on the circuits in your local area, the tracks. And this matters because without those local tracks, without that grassroots movement of racing that you'll find in just about every small city and town here in America, you're not going to get the next great future champion of the track in NASCAR or even the drag strip. You're not going to get the next high quality mechanics or engineers to create the next performance innovation. You're not going to get that. See, without the grassroots movement, there are no more champions. And that's why we, as fans of power and racing, we need to support our local tracks and our local drivers and help them out when they need help. Because it's not just entertainment. This is a way of life for them. This is how their family legacy. And then finally, we still race because Americans at our core love competition and we have to go fast.
The 2026 season for our vintage modifieds, sponsored by Bentley and Summit Racing Equipment. Everybody on your feet.